evening, friends and honoured guests. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful gallery and to this, our first memorial lecture in honour of Fred Jarvis, founder of the New Visions Group and an honorary patron of the National Education Museum. I'm Anne Swift, I'm the chair of the trustees for the National Education Museum, and I'm delighted and honoured to be here in what is a very historic occasion. Melissa Benn is a very influential thinker and speaker on educational matters. She holds a number of high-profile roles, and I'm very pleased to call on Melissa Benn now to address us. Welcome, Melissa. So, thank you very much. I do like a short introduction, because very often when you're introduced as a speaker, people just go through so much of your life, some of which you'd quite like to forget. Anyway, look, first of all, I want to thank New Visions and the Education Museum for inviting me to give this lecture. It really is an honour. And I do want to say a word about Fred. I don't think he ever sent me a Christmas card. I think there may have been a mistake. But he did ring me up often late at night. Only 3 people rang me late at night on the landline. That was my dad, my uncle and Fred. And they all had in common that they were a certain age. Now, those of us who knew Fred would agree that he was an original and a one-off, and a man who really achieved an enormous amount in his life. And I won't go through it because other people have mentioned it. I only got to know Fred later in his life and relatively late into my own middle age, after I won the Fred and Anne Jarvis Award in 2012, which is an annual honour awarded to, I'm trying to think what it is awarded to, public campaigners for a fairer education system. Fred took me out for the occasional lunch and he sent me his autobiography to read and comment on, and his photographs. And here's what I learned about Fred. I learned lots about Fred, but here's the essence of what I learned about Fred. Fred was not afraid. Fred spoke his mind. At the same time, Fred was not an impossibilist. He had clear political views, but he always worked within the mainstream political system, persistently lobbying politicians, advisors, friends, journalists, right up to the very end. But Fred also brought people together. His annual birthday parties, which had to be held in the main hall of the Institute of Education to accommodate the vast army of his political and personal contacts, were a phenomenon. And to be at one of Fred's events was, if only fleetingly for someone like me, to feel as if finally one had joined some kind of alternative education establishment, cheerful, resolute, and capable of making real change. So it's to this spirit, worldly, frank, collaborative, to which I have most often returned when preparing this lecture. And it feels particularly necessary at this political moment, as for the past few years, I, and you may not agree with me, have noted a certain kind of uncertainty. One might almost label it a lack of confidence among many experienced, thoughtful, progressive, labourish analysts and campaigners regarding education policy. And at one level, this unease is odd. Crisis is an overused word, but it is clear that state education is currently enduring a number of intolerable strains. Recruitment and retention are at historic lows. We're in the middle of a prolonged struggle around teacher pay, which is now uniting every single union within education. There is also a much deeper crisis of educational values, a worrying lack of transparency and democratic input into education, a narrowing and impoverishment of the learning experience, a punitive and now deeply unpopular inspection regime, insufficient funding, a sustained and dramatic drop in arts provision. And beneath all that, it's clear that most of the historic problems of inequality in the UK, in the English system, the UK system, the gap between the private and state sector, the hierarchy of institutions within the state sector have not been solved. Arguably, they have become worse than ever, if operating always in new forms with new justifications. Why then is this not our moment? Why does it feel so difficult to demand a range of clear reforms to recover and invigorate state education? Now, some here will disagree with me and say this is our moment. And don't worry, there are things in this lecture for you too, a bit later. But I want to stay with this feeling of uncertainty, certainly that I've had, of not knowing how best to proceed. Stay with it for a moment and to link it not just to the state of the economy or to the current caution of the Labour front bench, not easy to say when we have a member of the Labour front bench sitting right in front of me, but to the dilemmas that face the progressive left more generally. And chief among them is the devil's bargain that has been forged between a self-serving privileged elite and an ill-served anxious citizenry, which has dominated so much of our country's politics these past years. This bargain has really affected and distorted our education system. It's hardly a surprise, but I don't think we talk about it enough. Despite clear evidence of systemic failure and impoverished diet I've talked about for so many young people, much of the political and media establishment continue routinely to salute and affirm the changes of the last 13 years. The influential Times Education Commission said our system is greatly improved thanks to the Gove reforms. No surprise there, perhaps. I suspect many on the centre-right are relieved to see a nation of teenagers stuffed into dark blazers and ties, young people being subjected to a mass of tests and exams, the apparent tightening of the screws around discipline, and the traditional emphasis put on university entrance with, this is the Govian twist, education equality judged almost entirely by this narrow metric. For every disadvantaged child or young person that gets into a high-status university, the meritocratic grammar model that now operates through the comprehensive system, the drum is banged for a good job done. In fact, the figures of children on free school meals gaining access to Oxbridge have not changed that much over the past 13 years, but our primary and secondary schools have changed. The government and media obsession with Oxford and Cambridge in particular, to the massive disadvantage of a sector like further education, is again distorting everything. But there's a bigger problem, I think, I'm trying to be honest here, about what appears to be the tacit consent of many of the public to current arrangements. Now, most probably much of it influenced by media approval. But unlike the NHS, where dissatisfaction is high, public attitudes to education appear not to be so forceful. Calls for reform seem muted, all of which suggests that either a good percentage of people are happy enough with how things are, or alternately, so anxious about it they can't think beyond their individual choices. In short, I would argue this is not a 1997 moment, and we know it. Education is not the focus of collective public hope or the object of a set of clear demands. After 13 years of high-handed and ham-fisted Tory reforms, state education is a place of underfunded high anxiety for young people, their parents and educators alike. Yet it does not feel realistic or even helpful to call for full-scale reversal of absolutely everything that has happened in the past 3 decades, nor simply to demand consolidation or improvement of the 1970s settlement, as so many of us did even in the late 1990s. I think we have instead to dig deeper or sideways or wherever one does dig, I don't do much of it, in order to judge what we can influence and change, but maybe also to recognise and accept what is for now an irrevocable part of the new settlement, and then to think about how to reinvigorate enduring principles in new ways over time. And that's what I'm going to try and address tonight in 2 very simple ways. First, painful as it will be, I want briefly to look back over the past 13 years, the revolution in structures and personnel, as well as the prevailing narrative and tone of the new educational establishment that now runs and rules our system, and from there to identify some of the consequences of the change it's brought about. I then want to explore what a progressive alternative narrative might look like in current circumstances, and to suggest some concrete ideas and policies that might help take Labour, my political family, Labour's education policy forward as the party tiptoes across the next few months or year, carrying the Ming vase of hopes for a future government. So let me turn first to what I call the new educational establishment. At the end of last year, I was asked to write a general introduction looking at changes in education since 2010. for a book on reforms to initial teacher education. As so often happens, I thought I knew broadly what I was going to say until I came to say it. In an attempt to persuade me to write my 5,000 words, the editor had assured me that I could, quote, knock the piece off in an afternoon. Obviously doesn't know me very well. In fact, it took me months of interviewing, reading, Googling, and pondering to pull the piece together. Calling among many of those in the thick of it, education journalists, senior union figures, policy experts, teachers and head teachers, I found myself receiving emails or WhatsApps, some of them covered in intricate spider-like diagrams, setting out the key groups or individuals that have the ear of government, some of whom have moved from academy leadership or think tanks into official government posts, most of them are little known, and who appear largely accountable to no one but their actual political bosses. I also spent a great deal of time poring over the invaluable Education Uncovered website run by Warwick Mansell, who really has become the go-to investigator of the realities of academisation and latterly Ofsted. Call me naive, but by the end of my researches, I was really struck and quite worried and almost horrified by just how transformed our educational landscape is. The Gove-Cummings counter-revolution, if we want to call it that, has achieved considerable success in its own terms. We can see it in the corporate hedge fund style figures who sit on the board of the DfE, many of them appointed by Gove himself in 2010. We can see it in the rejig national curriculum, some of which was actually written and certainly directed by government ministers, overriding the advice of various subject experts. We can see it in the growth of some, not all, but some overmighty multi-academy trusts, many of whose leaders are paid more than the Prime Minister, not that he needs the money as it happens, while so many of those leading maintained schools or schools in deprived areas have no line to power at all. We can see it in the revolving door of centre-right wing, think tank policy experts, government special advisors, education entrepreneurs who have come to shape so much policy from curriculum to student loans to continuous professional development. We can see it in influential consultancy groups like Public First, one of whose co-founders led the 2011 free school programme and then went on to write the 2009 Boris Johnson Let's Get Brexit Done Tory manifesto. Public First now offers their wisdom and polling on public attitudes to education to a vast array of institutions, including councils and I think some trade unions, and who have led, along with Eton and other elite public schools, a new set of selective sixth forms in so-called red wall areas. We can see it in the recent reform of teacher education, whose processes are now as ideological and fragmented as the system itself. And we can see it in the politicisation of a number of official bodies, from Oak Academy to Ofsted. I think it's worth remembering that the appointment of Ofsted's current Chief Inspector, Amanda Spillman, was explicitly rejected by a parliamentary committee. And many now charge that Ofsted's advice on curriculum too closely follows government policy, even if that involves distorting the academic research it employs, according to the researchers themselves. Of course, one can also see the impact of the new educational establishment, not just in new structural arrangements around education, but in the diminishing and demeaning of older structures and institutions of the kind that Fred was integrally involved with. For example, the marginalisation of local authorities by successive Tory governments, despite the fact, and this astonishes me, 35% of secondary schools and 74% of primary schools are still in the maintained sector, and that many local authorities still do a very good job brokering all sorts of relationships in the local landscape. More of this later. And an even more obvious example, one only has to look at the government's relationship with the education trade unions, particularly those representing classroom teachers. This particular, and I would say slightly peculiar hostility, began, as so much did, with Michael Gove, who deliberately and provocatively treated the unions like an enemy army. Now, in talking about these developments, I've used the term we can see, we can observe. But perhaps the salient point here is how very little we can now see, or know, or debate, or influence. There is now little or no local input into many schools, although one will be told endlessly that schools are accountable through data, results, Ofsted, and ultimately through Parliament. Not only is this thin democratic gruel indeed, it's led to a system that is obsessed, with data and measurement, the apparently safe way of parading rigour from the earliest years of primary through SATs and the secondary years. One further development and a nagging worry to share with you arising from the past 13 years that I want to draw attention to here. The first is a significant shift in the culture of schools in general. James Mannion of Rethinking Education calls it the top-down monster, the widespread normalisation of a lack of agency and involvement in decision-making of most of those who work in our schools. As a result, too many are places of scant discussion, restricted professional or intellectual independence, or the healthier kinds of dissent. There's also been an official underwriting of a range of new right mantras, from phonics to knowledge-rich approaches to no excuses behaviour policies in schools around the land. And Ofsted has added to the general sense of surveillance and oppression. As the ideal image of the successful child within the current system is one of conformity and greater obedience, so inevitably is that true and become true of our educators. We know about the diminishing of teacher autonomy. Just as worrying might be a spreading sense of fatalism and a reluctant conformity among many teachers. Now, there's surely a generational aspect at work here. 13 years is a long time for a government with such a distinct agenda to be in power. Thousands of teachers will now have no direct experience of some of the impressive achievements of New Labour, its generous funding, its school building programme, its encouraging of collaborative work, its extended schools programme. And given the deliberate historical amnesia of the current period, and how little the history of our system now figures in so much teacher training, they may not know of many of the reforms, initiatives, or inspiring figures of the more distant past. Like characters caught in a dystopian drama, many may think, well, this is just what it's like. Why bother trying to change anything? My nagging worry is more directly political. It's the fear that those who currently wield considerable influence with ministers and advisors will expect to carry on in the same vein, whatever the political stripe of the next government. This could pose a problem for a future Labour administration that wants to make significant reforms or to reintroduce greater democratic accountability and depoliticise pedagogy. I hope Labour are consulting far more widely than the present government has done. So let me turn now to the significant ideas and silences of the new education establishment. Now, here we have to go back briefly, I promise, to the godfather of these early reforms, Michael Gove. What an unusual political creature that man is. Such an odd mix of smooth, unctuous company man, bold Secretary of State, and profound political disruptor. If you have a spare moment, try and count up how many prime ministers he has loyally served and then ended up tipping out of office. It's actually a good Christmas quiz question. He worked hard in the 2007-2010 period to elaborate not just on his free schools and mass academisation project, but built a new kind of Tory narrative about the aims and purposes of our schools. Here, he built deliberately on elements of the New Labour project, particularly its limited introduction of academies. But less attention has been paid, I think, to how much Gove & Co built on another Labour foundation stone, the comprehensive revolution of the 60s and 70s, albeit with significant Tory twists and a dash of disingenuity all of its own. The mantra of the much lauded free school programme, remember that, was good, all-ability local schools created for and run by local parents. How fresh and democratic that sounded. Over time, the free school programme has largely become just another element in the corporate charitable arsenal. Most free schools are now opened by existing chains, and it's a long time since I read about parental agitation, and it was always a particular kind of parent, for a good local school, let alone one which has been successful. You can correct me if I'm wrong. The free school unit in government has, I believe, now been closed down. My point here is that Gove and his allies simultaneously claimed and denigrated a version of the comprehensive revolution because, unlike their Tory forebears who long resisted it, they knew it was and is both right and popular. But they fashioned it in the mould of old-fashioned ideas of private and selective education on the one hand and cleverly focused their attacks on the mythical beast of progressive education, which was supposedly to blame not just for educational failure, but was also judged to be the prime engine of educational inequality. In 2013, Gove, in a speech to the Social Market Foundation, laid into, quote, progressive educational theory which sought to replace an emphasis on acquiring knowledge with a new stress on children following where their curiosity led them. And that was usually away from outdated practices such as reading, writing, and arithmetic, close quote. And in a book published around the same time, Progressively Worse, The Burden of Bad Ideas in British Schools, for which Gove wrote the introduction, teacher Robert Peel took up the same rallying cry with exaggerated emphasis, claiming that, quote, progressive education has given us decades of chaotic schools, disenchanted teachers and pupil failure. Hard work is not a fashionable concept in today's school, close quote. I think it's always hard to know where to begin with such distortions, such cartoon-style representations of a complex, not perfect, but a complex tradition, and particularly a set of differing practices that have largely involved decades of honourable and innovative intellectual and classroom work. Let me just pause here and name some of the great figures that I have learned about over the last 10 years. John Dewey, Winifred Mercier, Bridget Plowden, Robin Alexander, Dame Alison Peacock. Look back over their ideas and work and tell me that they didn't and don't represent some of the very best in theory and practice, advancing the cause of high quality education for all. Who in the political playground ever stands up for such figures and such important work? And that's one reason among many that we need an education museum that can correct these distortions of the past. Sadly, much of the reductive representation of that history went unchallenged. Too few of us, state school heads, teachers, campaigners, politicians, myself, challenged this nonsense loudly and fiercely enough in those early coalition years, nor pointed out that most teachers do not operate according to reductive stereotypes of progressive or traditional education. A second dominant narrative which took tenacious hold in those early years was that poverty is not only no excuse for, but is not the cause of educational failure. Those who viewed the challenges of schooling, at least in part through the lens of social class or economic inequality, were judged guilty of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Remember that subtle sneering phrase? Instead, borrowing from the hugely influential but no longer charter school movement in the United States, it was argued the effects of poverty can be lessened, maybe even completely eliminated, by traditionalist methods, tough discipline, and the driven labour of sufficiently committed teachers, idealistic, clever, hard-working young men and women in the teach first mould who would somehow scatter the stardust of their own attainment onto their disadvantaged charges, even if they might, as a significant percentage of teach first graduates do, leave the profession within a few years. Here in the UK, we were constantly told about the achievements of a few favoured academies and free schools, publicly lauded for apparently bucking the trend of educational failure for the poor, but often through a narrowed curriculum and authoritarian practices, and sometimes even tipping over, as in the case of my old comprehensive, into a culture of bullying, fear and favouritism, according to a report. A third connected narrative attributes much educational failure to a range of institutions that were often accused of being simultaneously lax and over-controlling, loftily out of touch and poorly performing, supposedly removed from the real world of the hard-grafting classroom teacher. This removed from real people line comes straight out of the populist playbook. The government has had in its sights trade unions and local authorities, as I've said, but also universities responsible for much teacher education. As Robert Peel crowed, quote, university education departments, the temples of progressive education, are in the process of being, if not cleansed, significantly challenged. So just as important as what this establishment talks about is what they don't talk about, and let me touch on that briefly. There is a set of interconnected silences, on everything from the historically unequal and hierarchical schools landscape, in particular, the role of private and selective education in perpetuating inequality. They don't talk about declining school funding, stagnant wages, excessive teacher workload, perhaps a bit more on that, and the impact of broader economic inequality. Remember, those early reforms were implemented alongside savage economic austerity. And as the OECD made clear, an improved school system has to march hand in hand with fair economic redistribution. These silences have become louder year on year, and the official line on them is harder to hold. The pandemic, rising energy prices, soaring inflation has only deepened the crisis for so many schools. I urge everyone to read Mary Boosted's searing chapter on what poverty really means for the child and the teacher in the classroom now in her recently published book, Support Not Surveillance. We now know too that some schools were off-rolling students in order to boost results. And this, plus the crisis of the pandemic, has meant that this week alone we read that an eighth of GCSE year students have gone missing. Now, I would guess that we haven't seen figures like that since the early chaotic years of the Second World War, when 1 million children went missing. It's also now well established through the work done by the Association of School and College Leaders and others that coalition-era reforms have systematically failed what they call the forgotten third. And last but very much not least, the crisis in special education needs is now widely recognised and calls for reform growing louder. Ironically, and interestingly to me, one area of challenge has come indirectly from private schools, many of whom have in recent years adopted what we might call, with all due care, more progressive and certainly more arts-rich approaches. I reported on this for The Guardian a couple of years ago and was struck by almost every private school head I interviewed insisted that the creativity, collaboration, communication and care mantra now sits at the heart of their work. A journalist friend of mine last week visited an expensive London day school, I know not all private schools are like that, where she described affluent young people, quote, this is from her text, almost gorging on a foie gras of creative opportunities in an environment that resembles a luxury hotel, close quote. Ironically, much private education now looks a lot more like the kind of schooling I had, in my many ways unusual, London Comprehensive back in the 1970s. And this makes it doubly sad for me that so much of state schools continue to be corralled into imitating cultures and pedagogies that belong to a long ago age. And in the recent words of Tristram Hunt, former Shadow Secretary State of Education and now head of the V&A Museum, that horrible disparity, that's his words, horrible disparity is opening up in the cultural education between the 7% and the 93%. So there's something deeper which I want to say before I come on to what do we do, because that's important. As a result of all the above, I think we've seen a decisive shift in values around education. And as a campaigner, I've come to perceive these assumptions and pressures now as the single most powerful block to reform and part explanation of why the public are not up in arms about everything, from funding cuts to continuing inequality. So let me try and spell out very briefly how I see these values working. For most parents today, their view of education draws consciously or unconsciously on conservative lower and uppercase notions. That is a belief in education now as the only real engine of individual social mobility, or for the middle classes, and don't ignore the middle classes' anxiety, the essential prevention of downward mobility. And for the poorest at its rawest, it's a route up and a route out. Getting the right sort of school place, the right suite of results and the right outcome has become a kind of scramble for survival. We can hardly blame parents for trying to work the system in whatever way they can, including those who live in the counties where selective education still operates as it did post-war, leaving parents desperate to get their children into grammar schools, largely so as not to be judged part of the loser majority and to live with that for the rest of their lives and their children's lives. or those who on seeing the dire underfunding and narrow curriculum of so many state schools dream of a private education, which still offers the best route to educational and professional success. It's not that the public admire those who are expensively educated, and we have Boris Johnson to thank for a recent redoubling of healthy scepticism, but they do envy them. They do believe that they possess some special quality that the rest of us do not, and they do want some of that for themselves. They have also been persuaded, again a classic from the populist playbook, that some mix of a socialist liberal elite, that's all of us, except if there's anybody who isn't, you can put your hand up later, wants to deny them their chance to shine, to escape, to become like their social betters, because the idea behind all this is that there are social betters, and it runs deep in this scheme. So these are all the ways that the devil's bargain I mentioned in the beginning has damaged a precious universal public service. And I think we've lost a sense of education like health as a public good, or of school as a time to experiment, to delve into ideas or subjects for the first time, to follow passions. Now, not just schools, but even nursery education is positioned as the first stage in a lifetime economic and status race. Anxious and ambitious parents, it's often hard to tell the difference between the two, are looking to access institutions at every level that will benefit their children, particularly secondary schools, selective sixth forms, which is a relatively new development, damaging formerly successful sixth form colleges in their area, and prestigious universities. Some element of competition is intrinsic to human nature. It drives us all, and intrinsic to schooling. But our system is too competitive on too few resources at every level, including setting schools against each other via league tables and single-word Ofsted judgments. And with the dramatic cuts to adult education over the last few decades and the appalling burden of student loans for young and mature learners alike, school does now offer the first and last chance for too many young people. So, how do we tackle all this? I don't think we'll do it by lecturing front-bench politicians of either party about neoliberalism. I don't like to use the jargon, it's not precise enough for me, but not least because some of these ideas circulate within the new Labour bloodstream. I mean, nobody believes that Tony Blair was enthused by the comprehensive reforms of the 60s and 70s. If he ever knew much about the history, he glossed over it, treating this important Labour achievement rather like an embarrassing uncle tipsy at the family barbecue. And again, some might date the beginning of neoliberalism, somebody mentioned it earlier, back to James Callaghan's famous 1976 speech, an early marker in the sustained assault on progressive education. And again, I believe Andrew Adonis and Michael Gove share some very similar views of what excellence in education looks like and how to achieve it. I say all this so that we do not get into oversimplified Tory bashing, much as I enjoy the sport. So how do we challenge this model? Well, I realised when I was writing this lecture, and I see I've fallen into what is known apparently as the 10th chapter problem. This occurs apparently in non-fiction books, I've written a few, about social problems, where the author, having elegantly laid out all the issues that need addressing in his or her previous 9 chapters, simply lists everything that has to be done to sort it out on the end. For those of you who want to consult a manifesto-style document for change, I suggest you look, first of all, at this very enticing document by New Visions, which I think has just come out. I haven't had a chance to read it. Or you could look at the more comprehensive proposals of the Socialist Education Manifesto, which outline a very different system to the one we have now. Interestingly, most of what the SEA proposes, I think, would have found itself in a Labour election manifesto of half a century ago. But now the SEA, the only educational body officially affiliated to the Labour Party, is largely treated as a marginal special interest group, leaning too dangerously to the left of the party. In my view, one sad measure of how much things have changed. But I want to do something slightly different in my metaphorical 10th chapter, which is to be a bit pragmatic. It's not an easy habit for me to get into as a long-time campaigner. With over 20 years' experience lobbying shadow secretaries of state, numerous MPs, journalists, everybody, on everything from selection to private schools to fair admissions to school funding, I recognise that the ideas of someone like myself on education, In particular, my belief that selection should be phased out entirely and that we should move towards a single integrated education system, as in Finland, are unlikely to be adopted wholesale anytime soon, even by the Labour front bench. Still, I find myself thinking far too much in this moment of what Labour could do if only it discovered a bit of boldness. And at the risk of sounding like a hackneyed special advisor, if only it developed rather more of a story around education. So let me play a kind of game here in my 10th chapter and tell you what I would do, feels a bit cheeky with you here, if I was Shadow Secretary of State for Education in this current moment, a year, maybe a year and a half out from the election probably. I think Fred would enjoy my imaginings, and I think he'd say, it's okay, Melissa, go ahead. So first off, I would develop a clear and well-informed narrative about the history of our education system, and I would use every opportunity to rehearse and repeat it. How many times have we heard about the role of the Attlee government in laying the foundation of the welfare state, and what a golden moment that was in our country's history? Compare that to the absolute silence around the phasing out of the grammar secondary modern system in most parts of the country and the introduction of comprehensive reform in the post-war period. Of course it's been a titanic struggle. Of course comprehensive education has faced tremendous opposition from the political and educational right, to the point that the C word is so often treated as synonymous with chaos and even war. I did the research on it, that's true. Of course, the model itself needs to be constantly updated and reformed, but as the Cambridge historian Peter Mandler has shown, it was and is what most people wanted and want: fair and expanded access to a good education, and the people want it. So let's tell that story. A past Labour government made that change. A putative Labour government should still claim the glory. I would make that case calmly and reasonably, not once, not twice, but whenever the opportunity arises, on any questions, on Question Time, in The Guardian, in The Telegraph, on the Today programme at 8:10, the only time anybody listens. I would also try to break down the stereotypes around the best part of our teaching and learning traditions. I might even remind people of the Plowden report, what sense it made, how it changed our primary schools, how much under attack Bridget Plowden was for her proposals at the time. What a rich cultural and intellectual history we have to draw upon, especially in this period of a crisis in arts and cultural and political education. I would talk more of the achievements of the Inner London Education Authority, abolished by Margaret Thatcher, its memory buried deep in some vault beneath our mainstream political culture. I would remind people of the achievements of the National and London Challenge. All of this could be done with the lightest touch, without a smidgen of defensiveness, relishing the chance to step away from the Tory narrative on our schools. And even, I might point out, what that party was saying on education in previous eras. Secondary models for the majority, anyone? Next, I would champion some of the excellent policy ideas that are, to paraphrase Milton Friedman, lying around waiting to be deployed in this time of crisis. Chief among these is a reform of our assessment system and the introduction of a national baccalaureate. The National Baccalaureate Trust, set up by Tom Sherrington, has done really good pragmatic work on how this system could evolve, blending it, at least in the beginning, with existing qualifications, remembering all the hoo-ha around A-levels and the Tomlinson report. Broadening out both the range of subjects available to students in the middle years of the secondary phase, making more room for the arts, allowing the mixing of vocational practical subjects with more academic ones, and providing a more individual experience for every child in our system, including that forgotten third, would transform our secondary schools. It would not only draw in that forgotten third, allowing them a sense of agency, success and enjoyment, but it would relieve the intense pressure that currently weighs down our most academic 16-year-olds. The Times Education Commission recommended a version of this. Rishi Sunak took it up and then went very quiet. But be bold, Labour, champion this proposal. The implication of a national baccalaureate, I think, is clearly the eventual abolition of GCSEs, a move that has the support of a number of influential people and bodies, including, I believe, Keir Starmer's own educational advisor. Getting rid of GCSEs would certainly free up the middle years of the secondary phase, save a large amount of money, and as Secretary of State, I'm enjoying this, I would immediately launch a consultation headed by someone like Jeff Barton, the articulate and effective head of the Association of School and College Leaders, who is about to retire, bring him back, and ask him to lead this review. And I would insist that the review draws on the views of teachers and leaders around the country and not just on the views of the current power players who dominate the new educational establishment. Next, I would champion the return of local accountability across our system. I acknowledge this might be a 2 terms in government project, but I would insist, it makes sense, to say parents have a right to a say in their schools. Schools are at the heart of their communities. The pandemic so clearly demonstrated that, and that it's not right that anyone can make an excessive profit or earn an excessive salary from running a public service. Instead of speaking directly of dismantling academisation, given the tremendous media and public backlash this would arouse, I would instead start with some small steps. Give local authorities the right to open schools once again. Hand local authorities control over admission policies of all state schools, increase democratic and local representation on governing bodies, and so on. David Wolfe of Matrix Chambers and Anne West of the LSE have some excellent ideas on how to implement such a transition. I would champion the existing work of the Association of Educational Partnerships, which puts the local authority at the heart of local relationships and has, largely beneath the radar, begun to address and deal with the problems of fragmentation within local areas. During the pandemic, I did a large piece of work for a big urban local authority, which has modelled just such a partnership, bringing together heads of both maintained and academy schools, developing a school improvement model that all institutions share and interestingly academies really wanted to be part of, and tackling everything from early years to special needs, curriculum and sustainability within the borough. I was impressed at what they achieved, and it redoubled my conviction that local does best. I think some new thinking also needs to be done on what role could be given to the relatively new regional mayors. Jamie Driscoll, whom Labour has, in my view, stupidly declared unfit to stand for office, stepping briefly out of my front bench role here, has done some inspiring work with his mayoral budget, and Andy Burnham has been talking to the House of Lords about his idea for an MBAC, Manchester Baccalaureate, which some worry would bring back a kind of technical and academic divide too early. Now, before my final point, a few miscellaneous acts that I must put in when I'm in power. On arriving at Great Smith Street, I would appoint a lifelong learning minister, and I would make clear that for our economy to prosper, we can't restrict education to 0 to 21. The next day, got to do things one at a time, I would announce that what is taught in our schools and how it is taught has been politicised for far too long, and I would set up something like an independent curriculum review body made up of subject experts and representatives from all kinds of schools around the country, which would be charged with reviewing the curriculum, and I would hope, drawing on the best international practice, to make it more light touch, to allow teachers more autonomy. Gosh, it is hard to stop now I'm a minister, but I must add 3 vital reforms. Finally, I would review teacher education and borrow from the example of more successful countries like Finland, where all teachers must have a master's degree. I would ask civil servants to draw up proposals for a fair and workable graduate tax to replace the burdensome student loan system. And given the recruitment and retention crisis, I would develop a workforce plan for England's schools, and unlike the current government and its equivalent NHS plan, I would not take over a decade to publish it and implement it. Of course, in my pragmatic mode, I can feel Rachel Reeves, Labour's Shadow Chancellor, breathing down my neck as I finally come to my last point about the imperative of greater investment. But I remember 2 things here on a human level. First, Rachel herself is a consistent and high-profile champion of comprehensive education and the author of a biography of Alice Bacon, who played a vital part in the post-war reform of our system and will, I hope, have an illuminated spot in the new Education Museum. Second, the single most prominent piece of Labour policy currently on education, which has received enormous pushback from the independent sector, has been its proposal to put VAT on private school fees, not all private schools, not special schools, and to use the notional 1.6 billion to recruit more maths and physics teachers. I welcome this transfer on resources on both practical and ethical grounds. But more funding is needed in every way for so many necessary developments. You will know them all. Early years, smaller class sizes, support services for schools, repair of school buildings, pay increases across the sector. Of course, every minister in a future government, Labour government, will be lobbying the Treasury for more money, but education just has to be higher up the queue than it currently is. The former Shadow Chancellor, John MacDonald, makes the case very powerfully that we have to treat increased education spending as a form of investment in the future and not as an unjustifiable, wasteful addition to the nation's admittedly already enormous debt. There are other ways of transferring resources within the system. I know it won't happen soon, but abolishing GCSEs would raise, I see, estimated 200 million. In the past 4 years, 64 million has been spent on expanding grammar schools, supposedly on the grounds that they would increase the number of disadvantaged students. In fact, they've increased that number by 0.7%. It points to one of the greatest enduring failures of our system, allotting more resources to those who need it least. A priority for me, therefore, would be always to channel resources to areas, schools and pupils that are the most disadvantaged, and I would work hard to raise the 2.9 billion that might allow us to double the pupil premium. Now, a final word here, and I promise it is about tone. For a long time, I've argued that Gove and Co had a form of boldness. It enabled them to create fundamental change, call it havoc change. And I've often asked, why do we not have a matching boldness on the progressive Labour side? I've even said it tonight. I've used that word. But for a while now, I've begun to wonder if I am wrong in some respects. And this came into my head again just this last Thursday when I went to see James Graham's fantastic play, Dear England, about Gareth Southgate and the England team. Now, I am not remotely interested in football. I grew up with 3 brothers, and when I hear Match of the Day theme tune, I want to just go and lie down and listen to Marvin Gaye. But the play was electrifying. It is essentially a story of failure, of the perpetual fear of losing one's nerve and the different approaches one can take to one's own history and the big task ahead. The old-style macho coaches and managers of the England team are shown urging Southgate and his squad to do the one more heave thing, to be bold, encouraging the players to be full of themselves. But Southgate chose a different path of reflection, even of soul-searching, of self and nation. He insisted his team needed a story, and they had to live and work by that story over the long term. The most striking thing about the play, and England's footballing story so far, is that it hasn't resulted in obvious 1966 type success. That goes to the women's team. It's always the underestimated that do well. But it has offered a new model to both the English football team and sports culture in general. Maybe I'm trying to say that there is a greater power in modesty and pragmatism, and it is right to proceed carefully with big tasks, both leading and always consulting those with whom you have to work. Maybe Tory boldness was all about their human detachment from, even a sense of superiority towards, the 93% and the education system that most of us love and rely on. Maybe Labour's caution is in part the result of respect for an exhausted profession who in so many ways want to be left alone to do what they know they want to do. And that human contrast has never been greater in terms of the educational background of the current front benches. Sunak's current cabinet is 67% privately educated, Starmer's 16%. So maybe Labour's job is or should be not just to change the story around education and public awareness of its own role in historic change, but to combine some clear commitments to continuing to improve our comprehensive system in admittedly difficult economic times with far greater consultation with all those involved. The best politicians, in my view, somehow manage to talk out loud to the public, talk to the electorate, set out what they're trying to do. And certainly it's time we had a government that believed in and backed the state system to the hilt and gave all those who work in it more confidence. The other night I went back to my daughter's old secondary school, a typical mixed inner London comprehensive, to wish a long-time member of the English department good luck in her retirement. Being me, I couldn't help asking every single person I met what they wanted from a Labour government. I'm fun at the party. First up, second up, third up, they all said money. They need funds to do the job they love doing, but they also wanted a fundamentally different approach. How do you sum it up, I said to one senior leader who bellowed in my ear, because you know what noise at parties is like, tell Labour to send us a message of competence and hope. I thought that wasn't a bad strapline. It has a bit of Gareth Southgate in it. It certainly has a totally different feel to much of what we have heard and endured these last 13 years. Thank you.